Good afternoon and good evening to folks joining from different time zones. Welcome to this event. We will start very soon. In the meantime, if you want to introduce yourselves, you can write your name and location in the chat box.
Am I in the green room?
So welcome everybody to this first event in our Inspiring Methods series. My name is Ritesh Kumar and I'm one of the team members of CMS InTouch. We have started this Inspiring Methods to inspire researchers in the CMS community to take on methods that address some of the methodological challenges of mainstream research. In this first session, we will hear about empowering methodologies, where we are particularly drawing inspiration from the editors and authors of Routledge handbook called Empowering Methodologies in Organizational and Social Research, which came out earlier this year. But before I hand it over to them, just a small housekeeping comments. We will have an hour for the session and the speakers will partly engage with you by presenting some of their ideas. However, they would also really like to engage with you, your questions and your ideas. Please put those questions in the Q&A so that we can organize the discussion more smoothly. Emma, Lauren, and Devi kindly also ask if you could indicate if you're happy to actually ask your questions yourself in an attempt to physically give voice to the audience. If you're happy to ask the question yourself, please indicate this in your submission to the Q&A. We will then allow you to unmute yourself and your voice will be audible to the audience. Your name will also appear at that point, but no video will be visible. If you'd rather get your question read out by the speakers, that is of course fine too. Please note that we have more than 150 people registered for this event. So unfortunately, we might not get to everyone's question. Okay, with that out of the way, I would like to hand it over to Emma, Lauren, and Devi.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ritesh. And I'm going to speak first. Hello, everyone. It's a real great opportunity to speak to you today. And I'm so excited that so many of you have been able to join us. And I really like the name of this series, Invoking Touch, the idea of keeping in touch, because I think that that's one of the challenges that we faced so much over the last few years. And I'm here in my house as usual in Cheltenham in the UK. And so it's great to be connected to you all virtually through this medium. But it's also somewhat frustrating, I think, in terms of the things that we're going to be talking about today to do with embodied effective connections. And that's why we would like to hear your voices as a small gesture of making those connections in a way that has a physical dimension as well as an electronic one. So as Ritesh kindly introduced us, I'm going to now share screen with you and talk for a few minutes about the recently published book that I have worked on with Professor Sunita Singh Sengupta at the University of Delhi. And this book came out of a UK-India Education Research Initiative project. So it was funded through that scheme. The title of the project was Empowering Methodologies, and the title of the book springboards on from that and involves people who weren't involved in the project. So trying to continually expand the network of those who might find this a useful concept. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by empowerment and why we use the word empowerment. And there are strategic reasons for that, which I'll allude to. But in opening this set of introductory comments, and before I pass on to Lauren, who is going to talk about her chapter, and Devi, who's also going to talk about her chapter in the book, I just want to dwell for a brief moment on why we use the term methodology. Only recently I read an article in Feminist Review which talks about the etymological origins of the term method, which is from the Greek, meta being higher or beyond, and hodos meaning route, but a particular type of prescribed or guided route, which has gendered and potentially colonizing implications for those who deviate from it. As others have argued, I think Razamir wrote a nice article in Qualitative Research in Management and Organization Studies about methodology being a more encompassing term. We're strategically using that to try to get beyond any sense of prescription. So thinking initially about the impetus for the book, it is in large extent a commentary on the politics of producing knowledge and the problematic nature of those politics, and thinking about all research encounters as determined by relations of power, whether or not they are acknowledged as, for example, qualitative reflexive research does, or silenced, as is the tradition of positivism and perceived objectivity and neutrality. And it was also driven by a frustration about the positioning of those pluralist post-positivist traditions on the margins, continuing to be on the margins, it continuing to be a struggle to find places for that type of research that breaks those very dominant boundaries in our field of management and organization studies of positivism. So in a recent review article by Kathy Cassell and colleagues, they talk about the extent to which qualitative research remains a very, very low proportion of what is published in the field, and it is not growing. So it's an intractable minority positioning that I think we've all experienced, those of us who've sought sought to extend those boundaries and do research differently. And what is more, it is potentially highly formulaic. There's a lot of talk at the moment about boilerplates, the Gioia methodology as a way of doing qualitative research. Prior to that, specific notions of grounded theory or case study research, which were based on a Eisenhardt kind of method. These are very, very highly cited and strongly dominant norms, even within the qualitative tradition. So there's a tendency towards isomorphism, that you emulate those perceived norms, those dominant patterns in order to get published. And also a tendency to neo-positivism, so that qualitative research is sometimes done in a way that still subscribes to a criteriology of positivism, so notions of validity and reliability. And these are highly problematic, these criteria, from an ethical, political point of view. For example, the whole notion of generalizability, saying that social practices and human beings in general form certain patterns and behave in certain ways, can be read as either implicitly or explicitly imperialist, that it imposes a set of ideas about the way things are that originate from somewhere. They don't originate from nowhere. And we can see this in methods. So Italian researcher Gianpietro Gobbo talks about the globalization of methods and the way that Western norms of doing research have gradually been exported to the global south. The core periphery shift of those methods is one way. It's one way, and it's an imposition in terms of power. So I think what is frustrating is that this has an effect, a very real, very material effect on our careers and our experiences of doing research. And in the introductory chapter to the book, Sunita and I give a few examples of that. An article by Anne Cunliffe, who talks about the 20 years of her career struggling, particularly in the US, to get tenure, to get a job as a qualitative researcher, to be recognized in the work that she was doing. We also give the example of Ruth Weatherall, who is an earlier career researcher working in New Zealand, talking about her doctoral research, looking at domestic violence, women who'd experienced domestic violence, and feeling that the constraints of the scientific method that she was being asked to conform to estranged her from the very people that she was trying to connect to as a researcher. And we give the example of Rashidur Chowdhury, who is Bangladeshi origin, but has been working in the UK for around 15 years, doing his research looking at victims and rescuers in the Rana Plaza disaster, and the way in which he felt estranged from those stories through the process of trying to conform to the norms of research. So there is a consequence for us as lived, in the lived experience of our lives, as well as our practices as researchers, that is troubling. So to get beyond that, we're trying to find ways of thinking about research that move beyond what Lorraine Code refers to as epistemologies of mastery, and to problematize continue to problematize the idea of inquiry as based on a division between facts as objective truths awaiting discovery and values, and because we believe that this simply drives values underground. They still exist, but they're unacknowledged, and in a sense, that's where they become oppressive to particular groups of people. So we need to move away from these dictates, these exaggerated notions of scientific knowledge making, and we need to problematize them. And we need to think about the reciprocal relationships that we build with research participants, rather than see data gathering as a process of extraction. And so it involves acknowledging that data is generated by people in relationships, and it involves acknowledging that there's no such thing as value-free knowledge, that ethics and epistemology are quite simply inseparable, because knowing is socially constituted and it's historically and culturally embedded. And so a way of thinking about this is to say that through making knowledge, we make and we remake ourselves. So there's no separation in that process. So what do we mean by empowering research, and why did we use that term in the book? Well, it wasn't a very widely used term. We couldn't find that much on empowering research, so it hadn't been sort of coined as a phrase particularly widely. There were one or two articles, including this entry by Davis, and we see it as connecting to a whole lot of other relevant concepts. So feminist research, decolonizing research, but also collaborative inquiry. All of these could be seen as complementary terms. And so empowering research is really a sort of umbrella concept, or a boundary object that enables perhaps us as researchers to talk to different audiences, including in ways which may not necessarily be as easy if we were using more overtly critical terms. So I think for funders, the idea of empowering research has a kind of seductive power that they're perhaps less likely to react against. I think we used it strategically in that sense as well. But very much always with the intention to use it in ways that enabled these different ways of thinking about what research is, but also as an alternative to emancipatory research, because of what we perceive as the potential problematics of a kind of intellectual arrogance that can be associated with seeking to impose one's definitions of an inquiry on those who are researched. So we see that from a feminist perspective as being somewhat problematic. So we decided on empowerment, although acknowledging, for example, in relation to organizational empowerment, all the potential problems that could arise there. So what is it about? It's about thinking about knowledge as something that is not obtained necessarily, that the process of doing research is as important as the outcome, and that the uncertainty of the process of doing research is actually not something to avoid. It's something to engage with, because the very idea of knowing is potentially hierarchical, and one that we perhaps have to think differently about. So the idea of not knowing as something that we can actually contemplate within research is one that we find potentially helpful to think about. So finally then, in terms of the practice, and I suppose this is something that we wanted to really dwell on in the book, and the chapters, I think, give lots of examples of these ways potentially of doing empowering research, although in no sense from an exhaustive or prescriptive point of view. Simply these are the things that some of us have tried. But it's about potentially moving away from dialogical communication, from telling and explaining, and the methods reflect that. The use of visual methods as ways of articulating not just rational thought, but emotion and affect, and also things like listening. What do we mean by listening? And we talk about that a bit in the introductory chapter. Listening, I think, is something that as academics we're not always as good at as we would like to think. And I think it's a practice that we really need to cultivate, and embodied listening is something that I would say is congruent with the notion of empowering research. So it's about locating study, it's about situated knowing, as Sandra Harding would say. It's about touching through research, touching others, but also ourselves in an effective sense. It's about our epistemic responsibilities, as Code would say, in the sense that we need to be constantly asking questions about whose knowledge we're talking about. And in my own work, the idea of craft has been helpful to think about some of those things. So without any more words from me, I'm going to now pass to our next speaker, Devi, who's going to share with you some thoughts.
Hi, Debbie. Do you want me to go first?
Lauren, that would be great.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, good afternoon from Cambridgeshire in the UK. My name is Dr. Lauren McCarthy. I'm a senior lecturer in organisations and sustainability at Royal Holloway, part of the University of London. And thank you, Emma, for your lovely introduction to the book. And I was really lucky enough to be invited to submit a chapter to that book alongside my PhD student, Divya Patel. So I'm just going to share my screen very quickly because my talk is mainly about visual methods. And so, as you can imagine, there's lots of visual here. So hopefully you can see the full screen here. And I've entitled my mini talk here, Drawing Together, with a question mark, because my method of choice for some of the research that I have done within the cocoa supply chain is drawing. So asking my participants, who happen to be cocoa farmers in Ghana, in this particular case study, to draw. And I was interested in the gender relations of cocoa production, and particularly in the work that men and women do to produce cocoa and how that overlaps with their own sort of domestic labour and the gender relations therein. So the title of drawing makes sense, but the together kind of raises some questions for me about to what extent can we call these kinds of research methods empowering, but also raises questions around participation and reducing what I would call a sort of power imbalance that we have between the researcher and the researched. Okay, so on this slide, you can see me doing what's called the Gender Action Learning System, nicely shortened to GALS in Ghana. And this was a methodology that I came across actually from feminist development consultant Linda Mayu. And already you can kind of get the idea that when I first started looking for research methods that would suit speaking to producers about gender, being sat in a business school in Nottingham at the time, I couldn't really find methods that seemed appropriate or inspiring enough. And they raised lots of red flags for me as an aspiring feminist researcher. So I had to look elsewhere. I had to go look in the development studies literature. And I also talked to some different NGOs about the kinds of methods that they were using. So the gender action learning system is firmly rooted in feminist methodology, in a kind of action research approach. And if you were to use it properly, you would actually use this within the community over a series of days, and we would progress over time and go back to that community and use different kinds of sort of drawing exercises. And the aim is one of, I would say, kind of empowerment and increased voice and participation. So I used this particular approach for my PhD, and then I went back 3 years later at the request of the NGO that I was working with to see what had changed. And I'm showing these photos because I wanted to sort of show a little bit more about the actual doing of this method. If you want to know more about, what the drawing and the gender tree and everything is all about and how it actually did it, I have a couple of papers, one in Business and Society with Judy Maturi, and of course in the Empowering Methodologies book. So I don't want to spend too much time because it's quite detailed to explain what the drawing captures. But just to raise some of the challenges here, but maybe hopefully inspire you to take the plunge and think about how you might use these things in your own research. So the two pictures here I've chosen because not for me, myself in the picture, but for my amazing assistants, Frances and Monica. And of course, I couldn't have done that research without them because I don't speak Twi, and many of the farmers that I was speaking to don't speak English. So I needed Monica and Frances to do this from the very beginning. And this raised lots of sort of anxiety for me around control. What if they're translating and it's not quite what I need, or how can I make sure that they also understand that this is meant to be a feminist bit of research? And we're quite kind of strict rules about not, for example, taking the pen from participants, ensuring that people always had the agency to draw what they wanted to draw, even if they weren't following, what we were hoping that they would draw. But Monica and Frances were fantastic because they were extremely skeptical of this approach. They thought I was kind of a bit crazy to ask mainly non-literate farmers to come and draw. The farmers themselves thought it was hilarious as well. They thought that it was funny that I was asking grown men and women to go back to school, as they kept putting it. But I also think that for me, this kind of raised an issue around thinking about the participants of our research in a much broader sense, because Monica and Frances were working in the NGO and the cocoa cooperative around which the research was based. And they said to me, we didn't think that these farmers would be able to do this, but that we've used this drawing has shown us that they can do much more than we thought they could. And so already it's starting to think about how research methods might challenge stereotypical and dogmatically accepted views, not just kind of in ourselves and with the participants, but more broadly with other people who are kind of in the orbit of that research. And thinking about also the way our research spreads out into communities, these are just some of the locations in which we did this particular drawing workshop. So because I was quite reliant on the NGO for getting access to farmers, for making sure that some people would be there when we turned up, it meant that oftentimes I didn't really know where we were headed. I didn't know what the location was going to be like. I didn't really know how many people were going to come. So these pictures show just some of the settings. On the right, we've got a cocoa store, and then the community kind of met just outside. And on the left is when we turned up in a more urban environment, and there just basically wasn't anywhere to sit in the shade. And so someone sort of procured some school benches and we sat just there and then, and started doing the drawing workshops with the men and women. And I think for me, this is also a case of how, for our research methods to perhaps be empowering, we need to maybe be a bit disempowered. I had to let go of that need to be in control, of that need to follow the kind of business school step-by-step process of this is how research should be. I was freaking out about the fact that I'd said in my ethics form that things would be, you know, private and anonymous, and it just wasn't possible to do that in a community. People would be coming by, stopping, chatting, looking at people's drawings, interrupting the interview. It was chaotic, and I think the first time that I did this research, to be quite frank, I was horrified. I thought, how am I going to be able to extract data from this? How am I going to get a PhD? And at some point, I just thought I am just going to have to let it go. And part of the process of letting go was that this is I included this picture because I just remember it as being a very hot, stressful moment. I'm having a bit of an intense conversation with Monica here, because this group was much larger than what we'd planned for. I had no idea if all of these people involved were actually farmers for the union that we were looking at. Analysing the data afterwards was going to be a tricky process. But in the end, I realised it didn't matter. There would be things that I could take from this research which would help me answer my research questions. But ultimately, this was about being part of a community and finding a different way of surfacing people's voice and their experience. And for me, drawing was a way of doing that, especially for female farmers that had traditionally been excluded from things like school or from even being given pen and paper. So they thought that this was both daunting, but also, I don't want to use the term empowering because I have a problem with that term, but I'd say a more inclusive way of doing research. This is just one of the other drawing types that we did, and this was asking producers to draw their household and circle who makes the decisions. And we could have done this by asking a question in a survey or you know, just interviewing people. And sometimes, because it took a long time, because it was chaotic, because people would, you know, labour over the detail or rush through and then be really bored, I thought, oh, you know, is this worth it? But to me, the process of drawing within a group gave us the time to ask questions, to have farmers kind of make comments that opened my eyes as an outsider to things that I otherwise might not have done if I'd just gone in with my interview questions and gone bang, 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 and then left. So these were just one example. And to sort of go back to my question of, okay, I can see the benefits here for me as a researcher, but what about for the producers? And this particular woman, she was a participant. She was an older lady who owned some farming land, and she had never been to school. And you know, the drawing that she produced was kind of incomprehensible. Like when I took it back, I thought, I don't know if I can actually capture what her story is here. But she said to Monica, who was one of the assistants, you know, this has been so good, thank you for listening. And she was able to sit within the group afterwards and kind of share verbally her story as well. And for that reason, I think that's why we need to step outside of our comfort zone and think about different methodologies and methods that we can borrow from different disciplines, that they're appropriate for the context we're in, and perhaps get a little bit closer to people's lived experiences. So thank you very much. I'll pass on to Debbie.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Thank you to the CMS InTouch team and Emma for this opportunity to share this research. I've been working on it for over a decade now with the community palliative care movement in Kerala, and it's been great to reflect on these methods that we've used over the years and put them in paper somewhere. What I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes or so is possibly share a slice of the chapter that I wrote, which was titled Vulnerability is Praxis in Studying Social Suffering. In this, I reflect over the methods that I used over these years, and I think through and think with Judith Butler's scholarship, with the intent that, to kind of re-examine for myself some of the ethical, political imperatives that confront us as organizational theorists when we study social suffering. Just to give you a brief snapshot of this site, I have written various papers on it over the years. This started with my doctoral dissertation in 2009. The community palliative care movement in Kerala started around early 1990s with a doctor-led clinic in Kozhikode, which is in North Kerala. And over a few years, it exploded to include community members who were essentially, very ordinary people, but doing very extraordinary things. These were bus drivers, school teachers, auto rickshaw drivers, and so on, who said, we have a role to play in palliative care, and we'd like to care for the terminally and chronically ill people in our communities. So I come in around 2009 when there's a fairly vibrant community movement in large parts of Kerala, and then the community begins to demand that the state becomes involved. And for me, this is a classic case of bottom-up institutional change, where community members mobilize to bring about public health integration. And so over the years, what initially began as a study of the movement, over time translated into studying undocumented workers at another site, looking at translations within India in different geographies, but also looking at assessing the outcomes of community-based palliative care in Kerala. What I reflect on in this paper is essentially it hit upon the challenge of looking at reflexivity. So I was studying the site of social suffering, and I felt that some of the tools of the trade that were available to us were, I found these limits in terms of thinking about the self as this person who you could just declare your positionality and then you're done with it. That's my declaration of reflexivity. And in many ways, I turned to Judith Butler's scholarship to make sense of some of these ways in which we could encounter the limits of vulnerability, right? So if you think about the tools of the trade that are available to us as organizational theorists, we see that a lot of it is and it's well written about now, global North-centric, and there are all these problems of representation that come with it. But when we look at the question of studying suffering, we hit upon these specific challenges, which are about, commodifying suffering or the appropriation of suffering, and how do we then begin to engage with that, right? So some of this we see in very obvious ways with sensational journalism or with reality television. But then I think in neoliberal universities, with these challenges of productivity and efficiency, we hit upon these challenges of swiftness of storytelling and so on, which I began to engage with when I was thinking about the palliative care context. And here, what I did was, in this chapter, I stepped back, retraced my steps, and in many ways thought, what does it mean to inhabit spaces of trauma, illness, and suffering? And the idea was not to develop a set of methodological prescriptions or best practice recommendations, but to rather think about some of these more messy, embodied, entangled ways of researching social suffering. So in many ways, these reflections have been shaped by my collaborators, but also as much by stakeholders in the field. In the paper, I unpack this with greater detail, my critique of reflexivity and why reflexivity in the way we engage with it currently was not sufficient, and that I wanted to think further. And I also explain how I lean on Butler's work on vulnerability, which just to set the page and to set the context, it goes more than the notion of vulnerable consumers or vulnerable individuals or communities or vulnerable other, but considers vulnerability as a shared existential condition, something that all of us are susceptible to, something that all of us can equally encounter through our practices, right? So what I talk about in the paper, and I'm going to just take you through a specific moment in this research where, and hopefully this makes sense when I'm talking about vulnerability as susceptibility. So here we are, this is a picture from one of our field visits where we're at the house of a couple who lost their 3-year-old child. I am with community volunteers who have worked extensively in this community for years. They know the couple well. This is the team, the young volunteers, and they know this couple really well. The couple also volunteer with palliative care services. So this is Shazia and Naz, who had lost their 3-year-old daughter to cancer a few years ago, prior to our meeting. And we met Shazia and Naz in their home, and the 2-year-old child whom they had after this loss was playing in the room with us. They talked to us about a previous event. One of the volunteers shared an update about an upcoming wedding. Shazia asked me about my work, and then she shared with me that she's a kindergarten teacher, and then we slipped into this conversation, and I read from her transcript where she shares the loss. Shazia says, after a few years, we planned a second child. We had a baby, and then she was 1.5 years and she was diagnosed. And then a long pause. Sorry. We had our treatments done from the Regional Cancer Center in Trivandrum. The child was treated at the Regional Cancer Center for 8 months. After 1.5 months, the cancer recurred. We went through all kinds of hardships. We know how those 6 months passed. I've seen children getting around 30 shots a day. So that is terrible. We did not want to go back. She could not sleep. She did not sleep well. She was disturbed. She used to cry in pain. But then we did not even think, never had a feeling that it would recur in 1.5 months. We were expecting, and after a year maybe, but definitely not so early. So that was very, and her voice trails off. And then she mentioned that they went to palliative care. Naz moves in and out of the room, never sitting for more than a few minutes. He fixes us a nutritional drink. He comes in, sits in a corner. But then after 45 minutes of our conversation with Shazia, Naz finally sits down. And he speaks with the community volunteer, Prakash, and they spoke about an event they were organizing together. I joined the conversation. We spoke about the event itself. And then Naz slipped into his story. And he said, there was a tube to pass urine. Motion was not okay. Surgery was done just 10 years back. The stitch from the surgery was not healed. It was a bad condition. We had to wait. More than 100 were first-time patients. We waited. There were children there, elders there, the waiting room, urine tube, bladder, and so on. And it continued. This mourning of the father for his child. Through over 2 hours of our conversation, the child is never named. We speak in their living room, the corridor, the veranda, the kitchen. The parents talk about the disease, the intimidating foreboding gates of the Regional Cancer Center, the long walks from the gate to the cancer wards, the endless hours in the waiting room, treatment, recurrence, pain, treatment, relapse, treatment again, their decision not to treat, palliative care, and her last week of life. They say the loss has brought the couple, both of them, closer. Their accounts fuse, then they sometimes depart. But both of them continue to volunteer with palliative care. Shazia continued with us to another patient's house where we would sit and talk to her. And Naz insisted that he would drop us in his car and join us later for biryani that night. So reflecting on this in the chapter, I talk about how I'm entering the parent space of suffering, death, and grief as a stranger. While I seek to understand the organizational aspects of care provision, this interview is intertwined with a collateral excavation of memories of their loss. How am I supposed to inhabit this space, acknowledging the intrusion of my presence over here? What do I do? When must I interject? What do I do with my presence? What do I do with my hands, my eyes? When do I reach out and comfort, right? So far from prescribing silence as an instrumental approach in such situations, I make a case in the chapter to consider how silence arises in these moments of unknowingness, much like what Lauren talked about. In these moments, not knowing is perhaps those moments of vulnerability where we acknowledge the limits of knowingness as researchers, of not knowing what to say or how to respond to the suffering of terminal cancer and the loss of one's child. As Yasmin Gunaratnam notes, patients' trauma, pain, and suffering is difficult to translate beyond the boundaries of disciplinary knowledge production. I acknowledge the limits of not knowing, of the skill of what to say, of what to do in this encounter with pain, illness, and social suffering, and the very limits of what we consider knowingness. This acknowledging the silence, however, is not necessarily an escape or is not an easy route out in emotionally intense situations, and it's important to understand that, because that can be another form of violence or a form of obfuscation of suffering, that we don't acknowledge this form of the suffering that is in front of us. But just to conclude with what Toni Morrison talks about, as in responding to these situations of uncertainty and chaos, we can respond with stillness, which may be passivity and dumbfoundedness, paralytic fear, but it can also be an art. And therefore, palliative care clinicians learn to engage with this kind of silence skillfully with patients in contemplative conversations. Veena Das notes that allowing the steadfastness of silence to do its job is acknowledging the antiphony of language and silence, which can make understanding and explanation possible. In many ways, these forms of engagement challenge our notions of epistemic certitude, epistemic authority in the field, that I, as a researcher, go in saying, I know. These notions of mastery and domination that is somehow received wisdom in the field. So I'm going to just move ahead with that. We talk about this in greater detail in the paper, but then I also reflect on vulnerability as collective care, how so much of my understanding was fueled by these collectives that were there in the community, how they nourished and sustained me quite literally in restaurants, walking through these streets, in between interviews, leading me into their lives, their marriages, their leisure time, just playfully hanging out with one another when I had these glimmers of insights into what goes on beyond formal interview spaces. And of course, there were moments of conflict, and this was his challenge one. These are moments of wounding. I think Lauren also talked about this to a certain extent, how these moments can be moments of reckoning with oneself and what one assumes one knows. But just to conclude that the whole point of engaging with this for me was finally to consider, how does one give an account of oneself? And this is where I turn to Judith Butler once again. And with that, I'm going to stop and maybe take some questions. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much, Devi. I think we'll turn to the Q&A now. I think we've got a variety of questions coming in just now, but I think we've got one from Jim that I'll just I'll say, because I don't know. Jim said he had to leave. He had to leave early, and now Jim said, I think acceptance through use of the terms, and so concepts of qualitative and quantitative research and/or methods, reinforce the problems you mention. I think both terms are nonsense, i.e. they make no sense. Why do you use them? So a nice provocation to kick off the Q&A there. So I'll just hand on to Emma, Lauren and Devi.
So how about I have a go at this one, because I think it was a term that I used. I don't think they're nonsense, Jim. I think they're quite important. I mean, this for me goes back to ideas about paradigm and paradigm commensurability or incommensurability, because terms like quantitative and qualitative are often associated with epistemological assumptions. And so when we use the term qualitative, we're often alluding to an interpretive way of seeing, which is about, you know, it's traditionally seen, the phrase seeing through the eyes of the other, or understanding reality as socially constructed. And so the terms quantitative and qualitative come with a whole set of associated assumption about knowledge. So when you're talking about knowledge, you know, they are relevant. I appreciate that they have, you know, there is a kind of possibility that the epistemologies don't necessarily associate directly, don't necessarily map directly onto the use of methods, the quantitative qualitative split, but very often they do. And so I think that the exclusion or marginalization of qualitative research in Management and Organisation Studies Journal is directly associated with the dominance of positivism and scientific, a view of science based on objectivist ontology. So the things are so tied up together that I think they're important. My whole you know, career as an academic and being interested in research methods has been about trying to make spaces for pluralism and not have monological methods, and very often that means qualitative research.
Thank you. We're just going to turn to Paul now. Paul.
Hi, thank you for this really fantastic talk. It's been really refreshing to just hear some of these perspectives, especially for those of us, I think, who are working in more you know, mainstream, very much established disciplines and departments. So it's been very nice to hear that. I do have a question about, there were a few points, Emma, in particular, that stood out from your talk earlier. And there was one comment you made that methods estrange us from ourselves as researchers. And I thought that was a really interesting comment to make. And you also mentioned the topic of embodied knowing. And I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about that, about how we as researchers, I guess, can know through our bodies, not just the phenomena we're interested in researching, but also our relationship to that phenomena. And also how we can translate that knowing into, you know, the standard journal paper format that we need to do to get us promoted.
Okay, I think this is going to definitely be a collective answer between the three of us. So I propose, Devi and Lauren, that we do that. I also think that there's an inherent tendency in the format of Q&A for me to, or us to be asked to give the answer, and we don't have the answers. I mean, let's be honest here. We're improvising, we're bricoleurs, we experiment. We acknowledge to each other that we don't know what the hell we're doing some of the time, but we do it anyway. And it's that spirit. So I guess for me, it's a stance. It's a stance rather than a solution. It's a willingness to put yourself at risk and also to try things, even if you're not quite sure how it's going to go. And that's the sort of openness to uncertainty. And it extends into the practices of doing research and being a researcher. And I think, you know, for me, that there's never a point where I want to stop doing that. As long as I, you know, have an academic job title, or, you know, this is my work. It's vital to me to do this type of exploration. And so, I mean, sometimes I've been successful in getting it published. There's all sorts of reasons for that, which we could talk about, but I think it's improvisation in a crafty sense for me. Over to you two, though.
I could take that. So, yeah, for me, I think, I mean, I agree with Emma. It's, I talk about it as an ethico-political practice. It is our position. It is political subjectivity. How is it that you see problems? How is it that you begin to see how problems are solved, for instance, and how people are capable of coming together and solving problems that are large scale, in my context at least, and how that thereafter shapes the questions that we ask in the field. What the questions that we do not ask is also important for me. The politics of refusal, for instance, to not engage in certain questions, to not, quote unquote, extract data, even if it means that my sample is not exhaustive and so on. It just means that I will not go to a site where there is excessive trauma and somebody is not willing to talk about it. So I think in so many ways, this is an ongoing question of reflection. It feeds into our everyday. It becomes epidermal. It becomes something that we live with in memories as well. So yeah, Lauren, would you want to add?
Yeah, I'm aware that we're kind of running out of time. So I was going to just briefly touch on the frustrations of the practicalities of both dealing with university processes. So I know that Sam, one of our attendees, has asked a question about ethics, and I mentioned this. My ethics approval took ages because they kept demanding that I give all the participants an informed consent form. Now, bearing in mind that these are farmers who have not been to school, that is unethical to give them a piece of paper to sign. And it took so much time to go back and forth on this. And I think part of stepping outside the box and is also about having to fight your corner and say, I'm not going to do it just because the tick box exercise demands that I do it. And eventually that got through, and I think that's made it a bit easier. For others, I hope it has made it easier. And a similar fight can be had when you're trying to publish using sort of more alternative methods. To be honest, sometimes, like Emma, I haven't been able to publish, and I've had to cut out the visual of my methodology in order to get through with that paper. But I do think things are changing. I do think that journals and editors are becoming much more open within our field. But sometimes you do have to be a little bit crafty again with how you use things like supplementary files and appendices to properly account for how you did that research. And I also think we have to be a little bit crafty sometimes in perhaps presenting a little bit more of a recipe card or a structured account of what we did, at the same time knowing that the reality of collecting that data was chaotic, imperfect, and humbling. I think that's what we can all share in our experience.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on next to Sam.
Sure. Lauren, thank you so much for that. You've just spoken to my question anyway, which was, I'm afraid to ask the formulaic question about how do you get this through ethical or institutional review boards? But I think you're absolutely right in that there are various different tricks that we can employ. But I was actually interested in how you negotiated that when you came back from the field. I don't know whether your university at the time had an ethical amendment process that you were supposed to fill in, or whether you would even be willing to admit to such things.
I don't know if I should say anything considering we're being recorded.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting that, in order to preserve an ethical relationship with your field, you have to engage in things which others might deem to be unethical in process?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, maybe that says something about the way that we have learned to do methods within business and management studies, that there's such strict corridors that we have to find ourselves to go down, that we end up lying or giving a false version of what happened. Yeah, like Emma said, I don't really have the solutions, but I think if enough people sort of also push back and say this is not appropriate for my research context, there isn't a blueprint that we should use, then hopefully it'll become easier for others.
Lovely, thanks. And we're at time, so I'm just going to go to Devendra now.
Hello, hello, hi. This question is for Professor Devi. So, Professor Devi, the way you narrated the conversation between you and Shazia and Naz, I mean, it appears that it was quite deeper conversation, and I'm assuming that you knew the language they spoke. Uh, so, does it help in knowing the language of your participants, and what you do if you don't know the language, because then you won't get that kind of a deeper response?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question because something I grapple with all the time when people say they do research in India, and India is just so linguistically divided and it so depends on where. So yeah, Malayalam is my native language, my mother tongue, so it did help. And I would like to believe I improved my Malayalam as I went along because it was quite fragmented to begin with. But I must say that I've done work translating this to Bengal, where I did grapple with language challenges, but there are different ways in which we engage. But interestingly, I also worked with undocumented migrants at Columbia University, and these were largely Latin American migrant workers who were receiving palliative care. And I really believed that language would be a barrier for me because I had an interpreter, I had a translator work with me. And it was really interesting how one of the workers turned to me and said, "You will get it. You'll get what I'm talking about." You know, she was undocumented and and I said, I really didn't see it because there was just class difference and there were all racial differences according to me and so on. But she said, "Well, you're brown skinned." And she was in this really white setting and she felt that nobody trusted her, nobody understood her account. And so it's interesting how these solidarities get forged or these interactions at the research site, which may not necessarily be language based. But yeah, for sure, language has a very different level of engagement for me, at least in Kerala, where I understand the jokes and I understand the phrases and the popular culture references much better. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Devi.
Okay, so we'll just hand back to Ritesh now, just to close off the webinar.
So we are profoundly grateful to Emma, Lauren, and Devi for having such a wonderful, engaging, and provocative session. I believe there are many key takeaways from this particular session, especially the new insights that you have brought to the field in terms of empowering methodologies. So before we go, I just want to end by promoting a few of our upcoming events, which you can find at the Eventbrite site. We also welcome any ideas or anybody having ideas related to inspiring series event. So you can write us at our email address, which is provided below. Lastly, all of the recordings are available on our YouTube channel. So you can subscribe to YouTube channel as well as you can watch it at your own time. The next forthcoming event is publishing critical work in equality, diversity, and inclusion on 16th of June 2022. So please do register for this event. And thank you once again for joining from your different time zones. We appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
And that's the room clear. Great. Okay, everyone, well done.
Kat, the recording is still